The Strait of Hormuz is open.
Iran's military is now saying it will close the vital waterway again.
The oil shock is about to hit Europe.
Said that the tipping point for Europe is June, because by then, Europe will have had to be able to replace at least half of its imports from the Middle East.
You must have noticed the high fuel prices and the dire economic forecasts, but the worst is still to come. Globally, we consume roughly 100 million barrels of oil per day, 20 of which are shipped through the Strait of Hormuz. But we managed to reduce the shortage to 13 million barrels, which still makes this the largest supply disruption in history, almost larger than the next three largest oil shocks combined. But besides high fuel prices, the oil shock is not nearly as bad as in Asia. Japan and South Korea appear much harder hit, and Australia faces much more critical shortages,
with more than 400 stations currently without diesel.
But this summer, Europe might face much more severe consequences.
And we could now be reaching a crisis point.
This is the global oil shock with hindsight. So where I live here in Spain, the oil shock is not that noticeable. It hasn't had the same impact on fuel prices like in other places in Europe or in the United States. And other countries like Australia are hit in a very specific way. And I'm gonna get to how the oil shock is rippling across the supply chain globally. But to understand the underlying system and how this will impact Europe in the coming months, we must look at two things: the scale of the disruption and our ability to adapt. Europe has been preparing for decades for the situation that is going to unfold in the coming months. Our addiction started early. In the decades after World War II, the United States began growing as a consumer of oil, while countries in Europe and East Asia were rebuilt around imported energy. At the same time in the Middle East, they found vast reserves of easily accessible oil, turning the region into the cheapest supplier of energy for Western countries. That framework was first tested in the 1970s.
It is an all-out war. The surprise attacks came early this morning in the air and on the ground.
Syria and Egypt had launched a surprise attack on Israel to regain territories. In response, the US and other Western countries supported Israel, and Arab oil producers responded by imposing an embargo. Oil supplies were cut, and widespread shortages followed. The price of a barrel of crude suddenly jumped from $2 to $13 per barrel. But later, following the Iranian Revolution, it tripled to $39. This time, it followed the internal collapse of one of the biggest oil producers in the world. These supply shocks had severe consequences. In the UK, petrol stations ran dry, forcing rationing and long queues. In the Netherlands, car-free Sundays were introduced to conserve fuel. On this chart, you can see the global supply of oil over time. It has roughly doubled, and following these events in the 1970s, the supply of oil was substantially lowered. In response, the world had no choice but to also lower demand. And if we just visualize the difference, we can see that the bottom line is that no actual shortages persisted. But this came at a tremendously high cost, and it inspired Western leaders to think differently about their dependency on Middle Eastern oil. This was increasingly seen as a strategic vulnerability, and Western leaders organized a coordinated response that consisted of two priorities.
We don't know how short we're going to be on gasoline for the car or fuel for the furnace. All we know is we're going to be short and we'll have to get by on less.
Western countries began to proactively invest in alternative suppliers, and they increased domestic production. In the United States, oil production on Alaska's North Slope was increased, while in Europe, they intensified development in the North Sea. These measures were intended to reduce dependence on Middle Eastern oil, while the second priority became to prepare for an emergency. They began accumulating enormous stockpiles of crude oil that could be released during future supply shocks. These reserves could combat high fuel prices or temporarily add supply during shortages. So Western leaders responded to the supply shocks of the 1970s by diversifying their supply, and also by building these massive emergency stockpiles that could be used to offset short-term supply disruptions. But the current oil shock is so huge that regardless whether the strait is now open or closed, the consequences for Europe this summer could be worse than you may expect.
The war in the Middle East is causing the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market.
So let's now look at how the oil shock is spreading across the globe and how it will affect Europe.
The price of gas in Europe is more than double the level seen before the conflict began.
But first, So the reason why we can make these types of videos is because we work with sponsors. And today's sponsor has solved an issue that as a small business owner I've had for a long time. You must sign a contract. So you go to Photoshop, you scribble something in there that terribly resembles a signature, and then you don't know how to convert this image to a PDF. It is unprofessional, it is frustrating, and there is a solution. Odoo is an all-in-one management software. They offer a wide variety of apps to simplify the day-to-day management of your business, including timesheets, accounting, and signing documents. Simply upload your document and select and drag the fields of your choice anywhere within the document. Send it to whoever needs to sign, and optionally set a reminder to avoid delays. You and the counterparty can now sign with just one click. What I love about this is that it's very efficient and it's very easy to use. And what have I told you that you can get this app for free? If you now scroll down and click on the link in the pinned comment or in the description, you will get one app for free for life. This includes unlimited hosting and support, and you can have access to all applications that Odoo offers, starting at just €19.90 per month. Try it today.
Attention all ships. From now on, all navigating through the Strait of Hormuz is forbidden.
These are the 10 largest oil producers in the world, and 5 are situated on the Gulf. All of them ship a majority of their exports through the Strait of Hormuz, and part of these exports are headed to Europe and the Americas. Over the past decades, Europe has reduced its import dependency from the Gulf to around 7% in 2024. But some European countries buy a far greater share of the oil that they consume from the Gulf region than others. Countries like France, the Netherlands, Italy, and Poland import the largest volumes, but vulnerability isn't just about volume. Whether the strait reopens or remains closed, the countries that are most likely to be hit first are in southern Europe, and I'll explain why. But let's start with the immediate impacts.
Our focus this hour is the Middle East, where there are growing fears of a wider war.
Israel and the US have unleashed attacks on Iran less than a day after indirect negotiations over Iran's nuclear program had wrapped up in Geneva.
When the US and Israel launched their attack, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz.
No ship is allowed to pass the Strait of Hormuz.
Global oil prices reacted within hours. The price of a barrel of crude instantly jumped to over $100 in March. But at this point, there weren't any physical shortages. The first priority was to get oil out in other ways. Saudi Arabia roughly ships 3/4 of its oil through the strait. The United Arab Emirates around 65%. But these countries have the advantage that they have some alternatives. Saudi Arabia has a pipeline that runs westward to their port of Yanbu on the Red Sea. The UAE has a pipeline which carries oil directly to a port on the Gulf of Oman. But these pipelines can't replace all that these countries are exporting. It only helps keep some of the oil flowing. Iraq has it much worse. They can only send very limited volumes of oil to the Turkish port of Ceyhan. Other than that, they're restricted to maritime exports. Kuwait is entirely restricted, and its exports have dropped to almost zero. This oil is shipped on immense ships. They can carry up to 2 million barrels of oil at a time, making operating costs insanely high. Fuel efficiency, therefore, matters more than speed, and that's why these ships travel very slowly, roughly 25 kilometers or 15 miles per hour, which means that once a ship exits the Straits of Hormuz, it needs roughly 3 to 4 days to reach India, close to 2 weeks to reach Singapore, and nearly 3 weeks to reach China. So that explains in large part why the oil shortages weren't instant. The moment that the strait was closed, there were still many dozens of tankers on the open ocean making their way to their destinations, and this can take several weeks. So the first countries to feel the more structural effects were the countries in the Gulf, and then the next domino to fall were the countries that were buying a lot of oil from these countries in the Gulf, and that looks something like this. This is what oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz look like. These are the countries of origin, and these are their destinations. The largest exporters are Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the UAE, and the top destinations are China, India, South Korea, Japan, and other Asian countries, who collectively account for 90% of export destination, while only a fraction of oil is shipped to Europe and the United States. Europe's import dependency is less about crude oil, while many countries in Asia heavily depended on these imports to meet their oil needs. About a month after the strait was closed, did the first oil deliveries stop arriving in Asia.
Parts of Eastern Asia are already facing a full-blown energy crisis.
It's all across Asia. These massive queues of people waiting to fill up their tanks before fuel prices jump even higher.
The oil shock then entered the global economy.
Rising crude oil prices are taking a heavy toll on Japan's economy.
In Japan, the government began preparing emergency stockpile releases.
Releasing the reserves might rein in speculative trading, but it won't solve the root problem.
They rely on the Middle East for roughly 95% of its oil imports. Similarly, South Korea relied for 70% on the Middle East for its crude. And India imports roughly 55% from this region. But the countries that feel the effects the most sharply are lesser developed nations. Unlike richer countries like China or Japan, countries like the Philippines and Vietnam lacked strategic reserves. They rely more heavily on spot markets, where prices instantly surged. These were the first countries to feel the effects of the oil shock after the countries in the Gulf. And the next domino were those countries that were doing a lot of business with countries who imported a lot from the Middle East.
My fellow Australians, by nature, we're an optimistic country. But I understand that right now, it's hard to be positive. The war in the Middle East has caused the biggest spike in petrol and diesel prices in history.
Australia doesn't buy much of its oil from the Middle East directly, but they rely on countries that do. Australia only has 2 refineries left, and together they can only meet 20% of their national demand. They strongly depend on imported refined oil products from countries that import their oil from the Middle East. So the trend that we're seeing is that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has created a ripple effect. An oil shock sounds instant, but it's really not. It ripples down the supply chain, and it can take many months before it reaches your country. And Europe is facing similar challenges. Countries have learned from the oil shocks in the past to be prepared for such an emergency. That's why most countries have built strategic reserves, including the United States. They built these reserves from the late 1970s and onwards, but after the pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they've released tens of millions of barrels of oil, and emergency reserves are currently at near historic lows. This oil is stored in 4 massive underground caverns in Louisiana and Texas, while in Europe, this oil is stored less centrally across dozens of refineries and storage sites. But European lawmakers have been more cautious with their reserves. They've largely been stable since the 1990s, even after the pandemic and the war in Ukraine impacted global oil prices. They were not depleted like in the United States, but they are only good for about 3 months' worth of oil imports. Even in Europe, these reserves are now tapped into.
32 countries, including the UK, all members of the International Energy Agency, approved the largest release of oil reserves in history.
It's the biggest intervention of its kind.
European countries then increased imports from the United States, Nigeria, and Norway, despite having to pay higher prices. Before oil runs out, buyers are willing to pay more. Crude oil can usually be imported from elsewhere, but the first real fractures in Europe's system became visible with fuel.
German airline Lufthansa says it could cancel 20,000 flights over the European summer amid rising fuel costs.
Europe doesn't just need oil. It needs oil products like diesel and jet fuel.
With dozens of flights cancelled, this could be just a taste of what's in store for travellers this summer.
These use crude oil as an input, and they are created in refineries. It is incredibly expensive, and it can take decades of planning to build a refinery. And Europe doesn't have enough refining infrastructure to produce the amount of diesel that it consumes. And it fills this gap with imports from the Gulf and from India. That is a much harder gap to fill. About 75% of Europe's jet fuel comes from the Middle East. Airlines are already scrapping flights, and the concern is what will happen this summer. As fuel shortages persist, fewer flights will bring tourists to their holiday destination. Air travel contributes nearly $1 trillion to Europe's economy each year, and it supports 14 million jobs. This will have a ripple effect across economies, but particularly in Southern Europe, where tourism contributes a larger share of national income. Poland and Lithuania are the most dependent on imports of oil products from the Gulf, but also Greece, Italy, and Spain import a relatively large share of oil products from the Gulf. These countries have smaller financial buffers and will likely be hit harder and earlier, while in Northern Europe, refineries in the Netherlands, Belgium, and northern France will feel the strain as they redistribute a more limited supply across the continent. In the end, we can only consume what we have. If there's not enough jet fuel, we cannot fly. If there's no diesel, pumps will simply close. These things are already happening in Asia. Europe is more diversified, but in some countries and with some products, it is just as vulnerable. Historically, large oil supply disruptions taught us our vulnerabilities. In Europe, our main vulnerability used to be an over-reliance on crude oil imports from the Middle East. We haven't stopped importing, but we have diversified. But we are now discovering that we have an over-reliance on imports from this region of specific oil products. While Asian countries might respond by diversifying their supply, European countries might push the renewable transition harder and might work on better emergency plans for jet fuel. Globally, this is the current situation. Supply has suddenly collapsed and demand has yet to be adjusted. This has created an unprecedented shortage of oil, but this cannot be. We have to adjust demand somehow, because this much supply is not readily available. It is impossible to have a shortage like this. Just like it has after past oil crises, demand must eventually adjust, and that's what's next for Europe and the world. Regardless whether the strait is open or closed, this oil shock will continue to show a ripple effect across the global economy.
Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime.
And was it all worth it? Most of you watching this video aren't subscribed to my channel. Support human creators like me and get more of my videos in your feed by subscribing to my channel and by turning on all notifications. After that, here are 2 more videos that you can consider for your next watch.